This was a situation which could not, in this region, long go unchallenged by those capable of disinterested thinking. The factory workers did, after a time, complain and strike. The mechanics of Philadelphia and New York organized, as they said, to ward off those numerous evils which result from an unequal and excessive accumulation of wealth and power into the hands of the few. But as Professor Commons says, this was not so much the modern alignment of wage earners against the employer as it was one of the poor against the rich, the worker against the owner. The workers, in fact, were only expressing concern over a situation that had already aroused men and women all over the region whose original point of view regarding wealth and work had not been altered. Among them, a deep feeling of unrest had grown as the old order lost ground. Their moral indignation had stirred as they saw the few living in splendor on the wealth produced by the sweat of other men's faces. Something was bitterly wrong in a land that professed both democracy and Christianity. Savagely, they turned on the new rich. Those who had prospered became a symbol of all that was wrong. Their crime was that they had accepted the modern world in all its ways. They had betrayed their stewardship. Here, wealth is new and mainly in the hands of men who have scrambled for it adroitly, said the Reverend Theodore Parker. As a class, they are narrow, vulgar, and conceited. They were never to be found on the moral side of any great question. They never asked what could be done for labor, but only what could be done with it. He warned that if powerful men will not write justice with black ink on white paper, ignorant and violent men will write it on the soil in letters of blood and illuminate their crude legislation with burning castles, palaces, and towns. Most spokesmen assumed, as did Orestes Brownson, that all wealth was produced by the toil and sweat, skill and industry of the workers. All wealth, said Samuel Allen, is the product of labor and belongs of right to him who produces it. Yet how small a part of the products of its labor falls to the laboring class. How large a part of it is wasted, and worse than wasted, upon the pride and vanity and voluptuousness of those who produce no wealth, and render society no equivalent for what they consume. The rich were exploiting the laborer, looking down on him as a vulgar creature, while they pocketed the proceeds of his labor, filled the high places of society, rode in carriages, sat on cushioned seats, and feasted their dainty palates on luxuries culled from every climate. Thus, an artificial state of society had been created in which a race of non-producers, who render no equivalent to society for what they consume, constitute a new sort of aristocracy of a more uncompromising character than the feudal or any landed aristocracy can ever be. Sympathy for the workers was equally intense. There was not a state's prison or house of correction in New England where the hours of labor are so long, the hours for meals so short, and the ventilation so much neglected, as in the cotton mills with which I am acquainted, wrote Dr. Josiah C. Curtis in his report to the American Medical Association. Could any beast of burden bear the duration of toil imposed on the factory operative? Asked one editor, and then added, how much better is a horse than a woman? Where is humanity? Asked another. It is swallowed up in gain for the almighty dollar, and for this poor girls are enslaved and kept in a state little better than the machinery, which, when it goes out of repair, is taken to the repair shop and restored. But not so the human machinery. That is kept in constant motion until the motive power is brought to a stop. And what of it then? It is laid to one side, and a new human machinery is procured. And what became of the girl who was laid aside? The Daily Democrat tells us that while those who reaped the profits dropped their heads on cologne-scented handkerchiefs in prayer and thanksgiving every Sabbath day, the poor mill girl came to Boston to die in a brothel. Instinctively, the word slavery came into use, and comparisons began to be made. At the South, wrote one editor, the master lives in opulence on the labor of his colored slaves, whose stimulation to exertion is too often the driver's lash, but who are almost universally provided with the absolute necessities of life in all stages of their existence. At the North, the master has a lash more potent than the whip thong to stimulate the energies of his white slaves, fear of want. And because the Northern worker did not see his chains, he was none the less a slave. Instead of simple chains, said this writer, he wears a net that hampers every fiber of his body and every faculty of his soul. Instead of bearing a single wrong, he is crushed by a boundless system of inequity. Both the Northern and the Southern master, added another, aimed at and accomplished the same end, obtaining labor and service without rendering labor and service in return. How can you reckon the one more atrocious than the other? Many, in fact, did not do so. As one man put it, when capital has gotten 13 hours of labor daily out of a being, it can get nothing more. It would be a very poor speculation in an industrial point of view to own the operatives, for the trouble and expense of providing for times of sickness and old age would more than counterbalance the difference between the price of wages and the expense of board and clothing. The far greater number of fortunes accumulated by the North in comparison with the South shows that hiring labor is more profitable than slave labor. Wages, added Orestes Brownson, is a cunning device of the devil for the benefit of the tender conscience, who would retain all the advantages of the slave system without the expense, trouble, and odium of being slave owners.